Welcome to the Sleep Story Haven, your peaceful sanctuary where the whispers of ancient forests meet the gentle rhythm of moonlit shores. Here, time slows to the rhythm of your breathing. Worries dissolve like mist, and your mind finds the peace it's been seeking. Each story is crafted to guide you through enchanted landscapes and tranquil moments, designed to quiet your thoughts and prepare your spirit for deep, restorative sleep. So find your most comfortable position, close your eyes, and let tonight's gentle tale carry you to the peaceful dreams that await. Welcome to your Sleep Story Haven. Take a deep breath and let our story begin. Winter's Sanctuary, a sleep story of seasonal comfort. Chapter 1: The Call of Quiet Places. The city had been pressing against Alina's shoulders for months now, each day adding another layer of weight that settled deep into her bones. The constant hum of traffic, the endless stream of notifications, the fluorescent lights that never quite mimicked the sun, all of it had accumulated like sediment in her soul, until she could barely remember what silence felt like. She stood at her apartment window on this gray December evening, watching the first snowflakes of the season drift past the glass. They moved with such unhurried grace, each one following its own invisible path through the amber glow of the streetlights below. Something about their peaceful descent stirred a longing in her chest, a whisper of memory from simpler times when winter meant wonder rather than inconvenience. The snowflakes seemed to dance just for her, swirling in gentle spirals that caught the light and transformed it into something magical. Alina pressed her palm against the cool glass, feeling the winter's breath seep through to touch her skin. In that moment, the concrete and steel around her felt less solid, as if the snow were slowly dissolving the sharp edges of her urban world. Her reflection gazed back from the window, tired eyes, shoulders curved inward from too many hours hunched over screens, skin pale from artificial light. But behind her reflection, the snow continued its eternal dance, patient and persistent, covering the harsh lines of the city with soft curves of white. Each flake that settled seemed to whisper the same message. There are places where peace still lives, where quiet waits to embrace you. The memory came unbidden then, rising from the depths of childhood like a gift wrapped in golden light. She was 7 years old again, standing in her grandmother's kitchen while snow painted the world beyond the windows. The house had smelled of cinnamon and pine, of wood smoke, and the indefinable fragrance of safety. Her grandmother's hands had been warm as they guided Alina's smaller ones in rolling out sugar cookies, the dough soft and yielding beneath their touch. Winter is nature's way of teaching us to rest, her grandmother had said, her voice carrying the kind of wisdom that comes from a lifetime of watching seasons turn. Everything slows down, goes quiet, finds its center again. Even the earth takes a deep breath and remembers how to be still. Alina closed her eyes, trying to recapture that feeling of absolute security, that sense of being held by something larger and more constant than her daily worries. The snow continued to fall outside, each flake a tiny messenger carrying promises of peace. When she opened her eyes again, the decision had already made itself. She couldn't remember the last time she had taken more than a long weekend away from work. Couldn't recall when she had last felt truly rested rather than simply exhausted enough to fall asleep. The city would continue its relentless pace, whether she was there or not. But somewhere beyond the concrete and glass, winter was painting the world with quiet. Her laptop sat open on the kitchen counter, cursor blinking in an empty search bar like a patient question mark. Alina's fingers hovered over the keys for a moment before she began to type. Cabin rental, winter, retreat mountains. The words felt like an incantation, each letter a small act of rebellion against the life that had been slowly suffocating her authentic self. The search results bloomed across her screen like flowers, opening to sunlight. Page after page of possibilities spread before her. Rustic log cabins nestled in snow-laden forests. Cozy retreats with stone fireplaces and panoramic mountain views. Sanctuaries where the only schedule was the one written by sunrise and sunset. One listing caught her attention immediately, its photos seeming to glow with an inner warmth that transcended the pixels on her screen. Whisperwind Cabin, the title read, and below it, images that made her heart skip with recognition. A small log structure sat cradled in a grove of snow-heavy pines, its windows glowing golden against the winter dusk. Smoke curled from a stone chimney, and the covered porch was strung with simple white lights that twinkled like earthbound stars. Alina scrolled through the photos slowly, drinking in each detail. The interior revealed exposed wooden beams that seemed to reach up to heaven, a massive stone fireplace that promised nights of crackling warmth, and windows that framed the forest like living paintings. The kitchen was simple but complete, with copper pots hanging from hooks and dried herbs bundled on the windowsill. The bedroom held a 4-poster bed piled high, with quilts that looked like they had been stitched with love and time. But it was the final photo that sealed her decision. The cabin's great room at twilight, fire dancing in the hearth, soft light spilling across hand-woven rugs and comfortable furniture. Through the large windows, snow fell in a private performance, each flake visible against the dark forest beyond. The scene radiated such profound peace that Alina could almost hear the silence. almost feel the way time moved differently in such a place. She read the description with growing excitement. Whisperwind Cabin sits on 20 private acres in the Whispering Pines forest, offering complete solitude and natural beauty. The cabin is fully winterized and provisioned, with a wood-burning fireplace, full kitchen, and all modern amenities seamlessly integrated with rustic charm. Miles of walking trails wind through old-growth forest, and the nearby Moonbeam Lake offers stunning winter vistas. This is a place for those seeking true restoration and connection with nature's quieter rhythms. The host's profile showed an older woman named Margaret with kind eyes and a smile that suggested she understood the difference between being alone and being lonely. Her reviews were filled with words that made Alina's heart sing. Peaceful, transformative, exactly what I needed. Found myself again, never wanted to leave. Alina's finger hovered over the booking button. 3 weeks. She had 3 weeks of vacation time accumulated. 3 weeks she kept telling herself she was saving for something special. What could be more special than reclaiming her own peace of mind? The reservation process felt dreamlike, each click carrying her further from the world of deadlines and obligations towards something that felt like coming home to a place she had never been. As she entered her payment information, snow continued to fall outside her window, and she imagined it was the same snow that would greet her at Whisperwind Cabin, the same peaceful dance of white against dark that had been calling to her soul. The confirmation email arrived within minutes, and Alina read it with the kind of joy she hadn't felt in months. Welcome to Whisperwind Cabin, it began. You have chosen a place where time moves at the pace of falling snow and healing happens as naturally as winter's rest. Come ready to remember what peace feels like. She began making lists then, but not the frantic, overwhelming lists of her usual life. These were different, soft lists full of books she wanted to read by firelight, simple foods that would nourish rather than simply fuel, warm clothes that prioritized comfort over style. Each item she added felt like a small gift to her future self, a promise that rest was not only possible, but imminent. The apartment around her seemed to shimmer with possibility now, as if the simple act of planning for peace had begun to transform her current reality. The harsh edges of her daily life softened slightly, and she found herself moving more slowly, breathing more deeply, as if her body was already preparing for the rhythm of winter sanctuary. That night, Alina fell asleep to the sound of snow against her windows. Each tap and whisper, a lullaby that carried promises of what was coming. In her dreams, she walked through forests where every tree wore a gown of white, where her footsteps were the only sound in a world gone beautifully quiet. She dreamed of fireplaces that crackled with ancient wisdom, of windows that framed perfect moments of peace, of a place where her soul could finally exhale. When she woke the next morning, the city was transformed. Snow had painted every surface with soft curves and gentle lines, turning the harsh urban landscape into something almost magical. The very air seemed cleaner, quieter, full of the kind of possibility that only comes with fresh snow and new beginnings. Alina stood at her window again, coffee warming her hands, and watched the world wake up slowly under its blanket of white. In just 2 weeks, she would be watching snow fall from a different window, in a place where peace wasn't a luxury, but a way of life. The thought made her smile, a real smile that seemed to rise from someplace deep inside her that had been waiting patiently for this moment of hope. The snow continued to fall, each flake a tiny messenger carrying her dreams toward their destination, where Whisperwind Cabin waited in its grove of pines, ready to teach her what her grandmother had known all along. Winter is nature's way of teaching us to rest. Chapter 2: Journey to Sanctuary. The morning of departure dawned crisp and clear, the kind of winter day that makes the whole world sparkle as if it has been touched by stardust. Alina woke before her alarm, not from anxiety, but from anticipation, a feeling she hadn't experienced in so long that it took her a moment to recognize its sweet flutter in her chest. She moved through her morning routine with unusual slowness, savoring each moment as if it were part of a sacred ritual. The shower's warm water seemed to wash away more than just sleep. She imagined it carrying the accumulated tension of months down the drain, leaving her clean and ready for whatever peace awaited her in the mountains. Her skin felt more sensitive, more alive, as if her body was already beginning to remember what it felt like to be truly present in each moment. Packing became a meditation rather than a chore. Each item she folded into her suitcase carried intention. The softest sweaters that would wrap her in comfort, well-worn jeans that moved with her body like old friends, books that had been waiting patiently on her nightstand for the gift of uninterrupted time. She packed her grandmother's journal, its leather cover worn smooth by loving hands, and a fountain pen that wrote like liquid silk. These weren't just possessions. They were tools for the inner journey she sensed was about to begin. The drive from the city started in the familiar chaos of morning traffic, but with each mile that passed beneath her wheels, Alina felt something loosening in her chest. The urban landscape gradually gave way to suburbs, then to stretches of farmland where snow lay pristine and undisturbed across rolling fields. The sky grew wider, deeper, painted in shades of blue she had forgotten existed beyond the city's hazy filter. Her car's radio played softly, classical pieces that seemed to match the rhythm of her tires on the snow-dusted highway. Pachelbel's cannon accompanied her through a valley where bare trees stood like graceful dancers, frozen in mid-performance. Their branches etched against the sky in delicate calligraphy. She found herself breathing more deeply, her shoulders dropping away from her ears as the familiar weight of urgency began to lift. The mountains appeared gradually, first as a blue haze on the horizon, then growing more distinct with each passing mile, until they rose before her like ancient guardians, welcoming her home. Their snow-covered peaks caught the afternoon sunlight and threw it back in brilliant flashes that made her eyes water with their beauty. This was the landscape of fairy tales, of dreams, of the kind of peace that seemed too perfect to exist in the same world as traffic jams and deadline stress. Elena stopped at a small mountain town for lunch, pulling into the gravel parking lot of a cafe that looked like it had grown from the landscape itself. The Pine Needle Cafe was constructed of logs and local stone, with smoke curling lazily from its chimney and windows that glowed with warm, honey-colored light. As she stepped out of her car, the cold mountain air hit her lungs like a blessing, so clean and sharp that she felt immediately more awake, more alive. Inside, the cafe wrapped around her like a warm hug. The walls were decorated with local artwork, watercolor paintings of mountain vistas, carved wooden sculptures of forest animals, photographs of the changing seasons captured with loving patience, the scent of pine mixed with coffee and fresh-baked bread, creating an atmosphere that spoke of simple pleasures and unhurried time. Elena ordered soup and homemade bread from a waitress, whose smile seemed to come from the same deep well of contentment that infused the entire place. As she ate, she watched other patrons, local residents, who moved with the easy rhythm of people whose lives were governed by natural cycles rather than artificial deadlines. Their conversations were unhurried, punctuated by comfortable silences and genuine laughter that rose from the belly rather than the throat. Through the cafe's windows, she could see the mountains rising all around the little town, their presence both protective and inspiring. Snow fell intermittently, not the hurried, obstacle-creating precipitation of the city, but gentle flakes that danced on the breeze, like confetti celebrating her arrival in this different kind of world. The final stretch of the drive took her deeper into the forest, along a winding road that seemed to spiral her further away from everything she was leaving behind, and closer to something she couldn't yet name, but could feel calling to her. Tall pines lined the route, their branches heavy with snow that occasionally released in soft avalanches when the wind stirred them. The afternoon light filtering through the forest canopy painted the snow in shades of gold and blue, creating a world that seemed to exist in a perpetual state of gentle twilight. Alina's phone lost signal somewhere along this forest road, and instead of feeling isolated, she felt liberated. The constant ping of notifications, the invisible tether to a world that demanded her constant attention, all of it simply vanished, leaving her alone with the sound of her tires on snow and the vast, healing silence of the wilderness. The turnoff to Whisperwind Cabin was marked by a small wooden sign, hand-carved and weathered by mountain seasons, until it seemed to be part of the forest itself. The private road wound through groves of aspen and pine, climbing gently toward what felt like the top of the world. Alina drove slowly, not from caution, but from wonder, wanting to absorb every detail of this approach to sanctuary. And then, around a final curve where the trees opened like curtains, Whisperwind Cabin revealed itself in all its simple perfection. The photographs hadn't lied, but they also hadn't captured the way the place seemed to glow from within, or how perfectly it nestled into its clearing, as if it had grown there naturally over countless seasons. The cabin was larger than it had appeared in the pictures, but somehow this only added to its sense of generous welcome. Logs weathered to a warm honey color formed walls that seemed to breathe with the life of the trees they had once been. The metal roof was painted forest green and wore a thick blanket of snow that extended its edges in gentle scallops. Windows of various sizes punctuated the walls like friendly eyes, each one glowing with the promise of warmth within. Alina parked beside the covered porch and sat for a moment in her car, hardly believing that this perfect place was hers for the next 3 weeks. Smoke curled from the stone chimney, suggesting that someone had been here before her, preparing for her arrival with the kind of care that spoke of genuine hospitality rather than mere business transaction. As she stepped onto the porch, her boots making soft, crunching sounds in the snow, the front door opened to reveal a woman who could only be Margaret. She was perhaps 70, with silver hair that caught the fading daylight and eyes that sparkled with the kind of joy that comes from a life well lived in harmony with one's surroundings. "Alina," Margaret said, and her voice carried the warm resonance of someone accustomed to being genuinely pleased to see people. "Welcome to Whisperwind. I've been watching for you, and I'm so glad you made it safely." The hug that Margaret offered was the kind Alina hadn't experienced since childhood, full-bodied, unhurried, conveying without words that she was truly welcome in this place. It lasted just long enough to feel healing without being overwhelming. And when they separated, Alina felt as if some part of her that had been holding its breath for months had finally begun to exhale. "The fire's been going for hours," Margaret continued, leading Alina inside. "I wanted everything to be perfectly warm for your arrival. Winter's embrace should feel like a blessing, not a burden." The interior of the cabin exceeded even Alina's heightened expectations. The great room soared upward to exposed beams that seemed to reach toward heaven, while below, comfortable furniture arranged around a massive stone fireplace created intimate spaces within the larger whole. The fire crackled and danced, its light playing across log walls that glowed like honey and casting moving shadows that made the whole space feel alive. "The kitchen is fully stocked," Margaret explained, her tour moving with the unhurried pace of someone who understood that sanctuary couldn't be rushed. "I've included some local specialties: honey from the mountain meadows, preserves made from wild berries, tea blends crafted by an herbalist friend who understands the healing properties of mountain plants." Alina followed Margaret through rooms that seemed designed by someone who understood the difference between house and home. The bedroom held a 4-poster bed made from local pine, its posts carved with delicate patterns that suggested frost on windows and snow on branches. Quilts in shades of blue and white were piled deep enough to create a nest of comfort, and the windows framed views of the snow-laden forest that would serve as living artwork throughout her stay. The bathroom surprised her with its luxury. A deep soaking tub positioned to face a large window, so that bathing became an opportunity to commune with the winter landscape. Thick towels hung from wooden pegs, and the vanity held simple glass jars filled with bath salts that smelled of lavender and pine. "The hot water is unlimited," Margaret said with a knowing smile. "I believe deeply in the healing power of warm baths, especially when they're taken while watching snow fall through ancient trees." They returned to the great room, where Margaret gestured toward a basket beside the fireplace. "You'll find everything you need to keep the fire going, and there's seasoned wood stacked on the side porch. Don't let it go out completely. There's something sacred about maintaining flame through the winter months, a connection to all the humans who have found comfort in fire's gift of warmth and light." As Margaret prepared to leave, she paused at the door and turned back to Alina with an expression of gentle seriousness. "This place has healing in its bones," she said. "It's hosted many people over the years who came here carrying burdens they were ready to set down. Trust the silence, trust the solitude, trust whatever wants to rise up from the deep places in your soul. Winter teaches us that rest is not emptiness, but fullness, the kind of rich, fertile quiet from which new life eventually springs." After Margaret's departure, Alina stood in the center of the great room, turning slowly to take in every detail of her temporary home. The fire painted everything in shades of gold and amber, creating a world so warm and welcoming that she felt her body begin to relax in ways she hadn't experienced in years. Her shoulders dropped, her jaw unclenched, her breathing deepened into the slow rhythm of someone who no longer needs to hurry. She unpacked slowly, placing her belongings in drawers and closets that smelled faintly of cedar and lavender. Each item seemed to find its perfect place, as if the cabin was welcoming not just her presence, but all the small pieces of her life that she had brought along. Her grandmother's journal found its way to the small writing desk by the window, where it would catch the morning light. Her softest sweaters hung in the bedroom closet like old friends ready to offer comfort. As evening approached, Alina lit the oil lamps that Margaret had shown her. Their warm glow adding layers of coziness to the already perfect atmosphere. She made herself a simple dinner from the provisions Margaret had left. Soup that tasted of herbs and love. Bread that was dense with seeds and grain. Tea that carried hints of mountain meadows and ancient wisdom. She ate by the fire, her meal accompanied by the gentle sound of wind in the pines and the occasional soft thump of snow sliding from branches. Through the windows, she could see the forest settling into night, the snow continuing its patient dance in the golden spill of light from her windows. This was what she had been seeking without knowing its name. This sense of being held by something larger and more permanent than her daily worries. The cabin breathed around her with the life of the trees that had become its walls. The fire whispered ancient stories of comfort and safety. And beyond the windows, winter continued its eternal work of teaching the world how to rest. Alina settled into the chair closest to the fire, her grandmother's journal in her lap, and began to write. The words flowed like water, carrying months of held tension out through her pen and onto the page, making room for whatever wanted to grow in the fertile silence of this winter sanctuary. Chapter 3: The Rhythm of Snow. Alina woke to a world transformed by the deep quiet that only comes with heavy snowfall. The silence was so complete, so profoundly different from the constant urban hum she was accustomed to, that for a moment she lay perfectly still, wondering if she had gone deaf. Then she heard it, the whisper of her own breathing, the soft tick of settling logs in the fireplace, the almost inaudible sigh of snow sliding from pine boughs, and realized she was hearing the true sounds of the world for perhaps the first time in years. The windows revealed that snow had fallen throughout the night, adding at least a foot to the landscape's white blanket. The forest had become a cathedral of winter, each tree transformed into a pillar of white-robed majesty, reaching toward a sky the color of pearl. The branches bent gracefully under their snowy burden, creating archways and alcoves that invited contemplation and wonder. Alina lay in the four-poster bed, quilts pulled up to her chin, and simply watched the world beyond her windows. There was no urgency to rise, no schedule demanding her immediate attention, no phone buzzing with requirements from a life that suddenly seemed very far away. For the first time in months, she had nowhere to be except exactly where she was. The fire had burned down to glowing embers during the night, but the cabin retained its warmth, testament to the thoughtful construction that had gone into creating this sanctuary. Alina rose slowly, her bare feet finding the soft wool rug beside the bed, and padded to the great room to coax the fire back to crackling life. The ritual of building up the fire felt like a meditation. Each piece of kindling and split log placed with intention and care. As flames began to dance again in the hearth, their light played across the log walls and cast moving shadows that made the whole space feel alive with gentle energy. She added larger logs, watching as they caught, and settled into the steady burn that would provide warmth and comfort throughout the day. Coffee prepared in Margaret's French press tasted different here, richer, more complex, as if the mountain air had somehow enhanced its flavor. Alina carried her mug to the large window that faced east, where the first hints of sunrise were beginning to paint the snow with subtle shades of pink and gold. The forest held this light like a precious gift, reflecting it softly from a million crystal surfaces, until the entire world seemed to glow with inner radiance. She stood at the window for a long time, coffee warming her hands, watching the slow progression of light across the winter landscape. In the city, sunrise was often obscured by buildings and haze. Something glimpsed between concrete towers if one bothered to look up at all. Here, dawn was a daily masterpiece painted across an infinite canvas, and she had a front row seat to its unfolding beauty. Movement in the forest caught her eye, a deer picking its way delicately through the snow, its rust-colored coat standing out like a flame against the white. It moved with the unhurried grace of a creature perfectly adapted to its environment, pausing occasionally to browse on the tender tips of branches that remained accessible above the snow line. For several minutes, Alina and the deer shared the morning, connected by the simple act of bearing witness to each other's presence in this peaceful place. When the deer finally moved on, disappearing into the forest's white depths like a forest spirit returning to its realm, Alina felt blessed by the encounter. In the city, wildlife meant pigeons and the occasional squirrel. Here, she was a guest in a world where wild creatures moved with ancient rhythms, following paths worn smooth by countless generations. The day unfolded with the slow grace of winter itself. Alina found herself moving more deliberately, as if the very air invited her to savor each moment rather than rush toward the next. She prepared breakfast with unusual attention to detail. Oatmeal cooked slowly on the stove, enriched with local honey and dried berries that burst with concentrated summer sweetness. Each bite was a meditation on flavor and texture, a reminder that eating could be pleasure rather than mere necessity. After breakfast, she explored the cabin more thoroughly, discovering details that hadn't been apparent in yesterday's tour. Built-in bookshelves held an eclectic collection that seemed curated for the seeking soul: poetry and philosophy, nature writing and mythology, books that invited deep reading rather than quick consumption. A window seat in the great room was positioned perfectly for reading, with cushions that yielded just enough to create a nest of comfort. The writing desk by the bedroom window drew her like a magnet, made from local cherry wood that had been polished to a warm glow. It held an old-fashioned blotter, a pottery jar filled with pens and pencils, and a small vase that held a sprig of evergreen, Margaret's thoughtful touch that brought the forest indoors. Alina arranged her grandmother's journal and her own writing materials, creating a space that invited words to flow. As morning progressed into afternoon, she found herself drawn repeatedly to the windows, watching the interplay of light and shadow across the snow. The forest was never quite the same from one moment to the next. Clouds passing overhead changed the quality of light. Wind stirred branches into new configurations. Occasional snow flurries added fresh layers to the already perfect scene. She decided to venture outside, bundling herself in layers that transformed her into a creature as prepared for winter as the deer she had watched that morning. The covered porch held a collection of snowshoes and walking sticks, clearly intended for guests who wanted to explore the forest. Alina selected a pair of snowshoes that fit her boots perfectly and stepped off the porch into snow that came nearly to her knees. The sensation of walking on snowshoes was new to her, but she quickly adapted to their rhythm: a wider stance, a slight lifting of the feet that made her movement more deliberate and mindful. Each step created a soft crunch that was absorbed almost immediately by the vast silence of the forest, making her feel like she was walking through a world made of whispers and dreams. The path that led away from the cabin had been marked with small wooden signs carved with encouraging words: peace, wonder, silence, joy. Each marker felt like a gift, a reminder to notice the qualities that this winter sanctuary offered freely to anyone willing to receive them. Alina found herself pausing at each sign, reading the word and feeling its meaning settle into her bones. The forest around the path was alive with subtle activity that became apparent only to those who moved slowly enough to notice. Snow had collected on spider webs, turning them into delicate works of art that caught the light like tiny galaxies. Animal tracks crisscrossed the white expanse, the delicate prints of rabbits, the purposeful path of a fox, the wing impressions where birds had landed and taken off again. A clearing opened ahead, revealing a vista that took Alina's breath away. The forest dropped away to reveal a valley filled with snow-laden trees that stretched to the horizon, where mountains rose in layers of blue and purple against the pale winter sky. In the center of the clearing, a wooden bench had been positioned to take full advantage of the view. Its surface swept clean of snow, as if waiting specifically for her arrival. Alina settled onto the bench, feeling the cold wood through her jacket, and simply breathed. The air was so clean it almost hurt her lungs, carrying scents of pine and snow, and something indefinable that spoke of wide spaces and ancient peace. No sound reached her except the whisper of wind through the trees and the occasional soft thump of snow falling from overladen branches. She sat for a long time, feeling something deep inside her chest beginning to unwind. The constant vigilance that city living required, the awareness of traffic and crowds, the need to hurry and achieve and constantly respond. All of it began to dissolve in the face of this immense tranquility. Her breathing slowed, her muscles relaxed, and she felt herself settling into the moment with a completeness she hadn't experienced in years. The sun moved across the sky as she sat, painting the snow with shifting patterns of light and shadow. Sometimes, the entire valley blazed with brilliance that made her squint. Other times, clouds moved across the sun, and the landscape settled into soft grays and blues that were equally beautiful. She began to understand that she was witnessing one of nature's greatest performances, the daily dance of light. And whether that most people never took time to truly observe. Eventually, cold began to seep through her layers, and she knew it was time to return to the warmth of the cabin. But the walk back felt like a completion rather than an interruption. She had ventured out into winter's embrace and been welcomed, blessed with beauty and silence that would remain with her long after the cold had left her bones. The cabin welcomed her back with warmth and golden light, the fire still burning steadily in its stone hearth. Alina hung her snow-dampened outer layers near the fireplace to dry, and made herself tea with herbs that tasted of summer meadows preserved in winter's crystal embrace. She settled into the window seat with her cup and a book of poetry, feeling more content than she had in months. The afternoon light gradually faded, replaced by the intimate glow of the fire and the oil lamps she had learned to love. Outside, snow began to fall again, its gentle dance visible in the pools of light that spilled from the cabin's windows. Each flake seemed to carry a message of peace, a reminder that some of life's greatest gifts come wrapped in silence and simplicity. As evening approached, Alina prepared a simple dinner and ate it by the fire, her meal accompanied by the soft sound of snow against the windows and the companionable crackle of burning logs. She was beginning to understand what Margaret had meant about the cabin having healing in its bones. There was something about this place, this rhythm of quiet days and peaceful nights, that was reaching into the deepest parts of her and soothing wounds she hadn't even known she carried. That night, she wrote in her grandmother's journal by lamplight, the words flowing more easily than they had in years. She wrote about the deer and the forest, about the way silence could be more eloquent than any conversation, about the slowly dawning realization that she had been living her life at a pace that prevented her from truly experiencing it. When she finally went to bed, snow was still falling outside her windows, adding to the blanket that wrapped the world in peace. She lay listening to the gentle sounds of the winter night, the settling of the house, the whisper of wind in the pines, the soft percussion of snow against glass. These sounds wove themselves into a lullaby that carried her into the deepest, most restful sleep she had experienced in years. In her dreams, she walked through forests where every tree was draped in white, where the only footprints in the snow were her own, where silence held her like a loving embrace and taught her that peace was not something to be found, but something to be remembered, a natural state that had been there all along, waiting patiently for her return. Chapter 4: Hearthlight and Memory. The fourth day dawned with a quality of light that transformed the world beyond Alina's windows into something from a fairy tale. Ice crystals had formed on the glass during the night, creating intricate patterns that looked as if winter spirits had painted them while she slept. The forest outside sparkled with hoarfrost, each branch and needle outlined in white fire that caught the early sunlight and threw it back in brilliant fragments. Alina woke slowly, luxuriously, her body finally beginning to remember what it felt like to sleep without the anxiety that had plagued her for months. Her dreams had been filled with gentle images, snow falling on quiet meadows, warm fires crackling in stone hearths, the sensation of being held by something vast and loving that asked nothing of her but presence. The fire had burned low during the night, but embers still glowed in the heart of the stone hearth. She built it up again, this ritual becoming as natural as breathing, and watched the flames catch and dance with renewed energy. The sound of the fire was different this morning, more musical, as if the logs themselves were singing of comfort and home. Coffee tasted even richer in the crystalline air of early morning, and Alina carried her mug to the great room's largest window to watch the sunrise paint the frost-covered world. The light moved slowly across the landscape, transforming ice into diamonds and shadows into pools of deepest blue. A cardinal landed on a nearby branch, its red feathers so vivid against the white that it seemed like a flame given wings. As she stood at the window, sipping coffee and watching the world wake up, Alina felt a stirring in her chest, not anxiety or urgency, but something warmer and deeper. It took her a moment to recognize the feeling: contentment, pure, simple satisfaction with exactly where she was and what she was doing. When had she last felt this? When had her life last included moments of such perfect sufficiency? The memory came to her gradually, rising from depths she hadn't visited in years. She was 12 years old, spending Christmas break at her grandmother's house in the mountains. Snow had fallen for 3 days straight, creating a world of white wonder that trapped them happily inside with books and games and endless conversations by the fire. Her grandmother had been a master of quiet celebration, turning simple moments into something sacred. She made hot chocolate from scratch, rich and dark, and topped with real whipped cream. She taught Alina to knit by firelight, their fingers working in comfortable rhythm, while stories flowed between them like water from a deep spring. Most precious of all were the evenings when they would simply sit together in the firelight, not needing to talk, sharing the deep communion that comes from feeling perfectly safe and perfectly loved. The secret to winter, her grandmother had said one evening as they watched snow fall past the window, is understanding that it's not about surviving the cold. It's about discovering how warm you can be when you stop fighting the season and start embracing what it offers. Alina had been too young then to fully understand, but now, standing in her own winter sanctuary, she felt the truth of those words settling into her bones. She had been fighting so many things, deadlines and expectations, the relentless pace of modern life, her own need for rest and reflection. What if, instead of fighting, she simply embraced what this season of her life was offering? The thought was so liberating that she actually laughed out loud, the sound surprising her in the cabin's gentle quiet. When had she last laughed simply from joy, rather than politeness or nervousness? The cardinal outside seemed to approve, tilting its bright head, as if acknowledging her moment of discovery. Breakfast became a celebration rather than a necessity. Alina prepared pancakes from scratch, using a recipe she found in a handwritten cookbook that Margaret had left in the kitchen. The mixing and stirring felt meditative, each ingredient adding its own gift to the whole. The griddle heated evenly on the wood-burning stove, and the pancakes cooked to golden perfection, while the kitchen filled with aromas that spoke of home and comfort and unhurried mornings. She ate slowly, savoring not just the taste, but the entire experience, the weight of the fork in her hand, the way maple syrup pooled in golden rivers between the pancake's fluffy layers, the warmth that spread through her chest with each bite. Outside the kitchen window, chickadees flitted between the bird feeder that Margaret had thoughtfully filled and the snow-laden branches, their cheerful presence adding movement and life to the winter tableau. After breakfast, Alina found herself drawn to the bookshelf that lined one wall of the great room. The collection seemed curated with the wisdom of someone who understood the difference between reading for escape and reading for nourishment. Her fingers traced the spines until they settled on a volume of Mary Oliver's poetry, its cover worn soft by appreciative hands. She settled into the window seat with the book, wrapped in a quilt that smelled faintly of lavender and sunshine. The poems opened doorways to ways of seeing she had forgotten were possible. Invitations to notice the sacred in the ordinary, to find wonder in the simple fact of being alive and aware in a world full of beauty. Tell me, what is it you plan to do with your one wild and precious life? The lines seemed to leap from the page and settle directly into her heart, not as a challenge, but as a gentle question that carried no judgment, only curiosity. What was she planning to do? What did she want to do when the noise of expectations and obligations quieted enough for her to hear her own voice? The fire crackled softly as she read, its warmth reaching across the room to embrace her in her nest of quilts and poetry. Outside, the world continued its patient dance of winter, snow falling in gentle veils, branches swaying in rhythm with the wind, the whole landscape breathing with the deep contentment of a season that knew its purpose. As the morning progressed, Alina found herself setting the book aside frequently, not from boredom, but from abundance. Each poem delivered so much nourishment that she needed time to digest it, to let its images and insights settle into the quiet spaces of her mind. She would read a few lines, then sit gazing out at the forest, feeling the words work their magic in the wordless depths of her being. Lunch was another exercise in mindful simplicity, soup that warmed her from the inside out, bread still fragrant from yesterday's baking, tea that carried hints of bergamot and mountain meadows. She ate by the fire, her meal accompanied by the gentle percussion of ice crystals tapping against the windows as the wind picked up outside. The afternoon brought a gift she hadn't expected. Her first winter storm. It began with a subtle shift in the light, the sky taking on a particular quality that spoke of snow to come. The temperature dropped, and the wind began to sing in the pines with a voice that was both wild and somehow comforting. Alina watched from the warmth of the cabin as the storm gathered strength, transforming the gentle snowfall of the morning into something more dramatic and alive. The wind sculpted the falling snow into spirals and waves, creating temporary sculptures that formed and dissolved with the breathtaking impermanence of art made from weather itself. Rather than feeling threatened by the storm's power, Alina felt embraced by it. The cabin stood solid and warm around her, its log walls proof against the wind, its windows offering her a front row seat to nature's magnificent performance. She added more wood to the fire and lit several oil lamps, creating a golden refuge that felt even more precious for being surrounded by winter's wild energy. As evening approached, the storm intensified, but so did the sense of coziness within the cabin. Alina prepared a hearty stew that filled the kitchen with aromas of herbs and slow-cooked vegetables, the kind of meal that seemed designed for stormy nights when the outside world grew fierce and the inside world became infinitely dear. She ate dinner by lamplight, while the storm painted abstract art on the windows with wind and snow. The fire danced higher, as if responding to the energy of the weather, and its light played across the log walls in patterns that seemed almost alive. This was what her grandmother had meant about embracing winter's gifts. The way a storm could make a warm home feel like the most precious place on earth. After dinner, Alina settled into the chair closest to the fire with her grandmother's journal. But instead of writing immediately, she simply sat and listened. The storm sang in the chimney with a voice like distant music. The logs settled in the fireplace with small conversations of their own. And beneath it, all was the deep silence that holds all sounds, the quiet that exists at the center of every moment, waiting to be noticed. When she finally began to write, the words flowed like water finding its level, carrying thoughts and feelings that had been gathering in the quiet corners of her mind for days. She wrote about the cardinal that had brightened her morning, about the way poetry could crack open the heart and let light in, about the profound shift that was happening inside her as she learned to move at winter's pace rather than the world's. "I am remembering," she wrote, "what it feels like to be fully present in my own life. The city taught me to live always slightly ahead of myself, rushing toward the next moment, the next achievement, the next requirement. Here, in this blessed quiet, I am learning to inhabit each moment completely, to find richness in the simple fact of breathing and being aware." The storm continued through the evening, but its wildness only served to make the cabin feel more secure, more like a sanctuary carved out of the wilderness by hands that understood the deep human need for shelter and warmth. Alina wrote until her hand grew tired, then simply sat by the fire, watching the flames dance and feeling the storm's energy flowing around her warm, safe haven. That night, she fell asleep to the sound of wind in the pines and snow against the windows. But these sounds didn't disturb her rest. They created a cocoon of white noise that seemed designed specifically for deep, healing sleep. In her dreams, she was a child again in her grandmother's house, safe and loved, and surrounded by the kind of peace that makes everything right with the world. When she woke the next morning, the storm had passed, leaving behind a world transformed. Snow had drifted against the cabin's walls in graceful curves. The trees wore thicker gowns of white, and the entire landscape sparkled with the crystal brilliance that follows winter storms. The silence was profound, not empty, but full, pregnant with the kind of peace that comes after nature has reminded the world of its power, and then settled back into gentle rest. Alina stood at the bedroom window, coffee warming her hands, and felt something fundamental shifting inside her chest. The urgent, grasping energy that had driven her for so long was giving way to something softer, but no less powerful. A deep contentment that asked nothing more than to be present, to notice, to appreciate the extraordinary gift of this ordinary moment. The fire still glowed in the great room, faithful and warm, ready to welcome another day of quiet discovery. Outside, the post-storm world waited to be explored, but there was no hurry. Time had taken on a different quality here, expanding and contracting according to the rhythm of her breath, rather than the demands of any external schedule. She was beginning to understand that this was what healing looked like. Not dramatic transformation, but gentle return. The slow remembering of what peace felt like when it lived in the very center of her being rather than existing as some distant goal to be achieved. Winter was teaching her its greatest lesson. That rest is not the absence of life, but life's deepest expression. The fertile quiet from which all growth eventually springs. Chapter 5: The Language of Solitude. A week into her stay at Whisperwind Cabin, Alina woke to discover that silence had taken on texture and dimension, becoming less an absence of sound and more a presence in its own right. The quality of quiet varied throughout the day. The crisp, anticipatory silence of early morning, the full-bodied tranquility of midday, when even the wind held its breath, the deep, embracing stillness of evening that seemed to rise from the earth itself. This morning's silence carried a particular sweetness, like the hushed moment before a symphony begins, when the entire world seems to lean forward in expectation. Alina lay in her nest of quilts, perfectly warm despite the cold that painted frost flowers on the windows, and felt herself settling even deeper into the rhythm of this place that existed outside of ordinary time. The past week had taught her that solitude and loneliness were entirely different creatures. Loneliness was the ache of disconnection, the feeling of being cut off from sources of love and understanding. Solitude, she was learning, was connection's deepest expression, a communion with parts of herself that could only emerge in the sanctuary of unhurried quiet. She rose slowly, her body moving with the deliberate grace she was beginning to adopt as naturally as breathing. The fire had burned down to glowing coals during the night, but the cabin retained its warmth, wrapping around her like a familiar embrace. Building up the fire had become a morning meditation, each piece of kindling placed with intention, each breath that coaxed the flames to life, feeling like a prayer of gratitude. Coffee prepared in the French press had evolved into a ritual that marked the transition from sleep to waking awareness. Alina carried her mug to the great room's eastern window, where the first light of dawn was beginning to paint the snow with subtle shades of rose and gold. A great blue heron stood motionless at the edge of what she had learned was Moonbeam Lake, barely visible through the trees. Its stillness so complete that it seemed carved from the morning itself. She watched the heron for nearly an hour, during which it moved perhaps twice, once to shift its weight almost imperceptibly from one foot to the other, once to turn its magnificent head by degrees to scan a different section of the lake's edge. There was something profoundly teaching in the bird's patience, its ability to exist completely in each moment without restlessness or hurry. When the heron finally stepped forward with liquid grace and speared a fish from the lake's dark waters, Alina felt as if she had witnessed something sacred, not just the capture of prey, but the perfect expression of presence rewarded. The bird's patience hadn't been empty waiting, but full attention, every sense alive and ready for the moment when action would serve life. Breakfast became another opportunity to practice the heron's gift of presence. Alina prepared oatmeal with the same deliberate attention the bird had brought to its fishing, stirring clockwise while honey dissolved into golden spirals, adding dried cranberries that burst with concentrated tartness against her tongue. Each spoonful was an exercise in gratitude, her body receiving nourishment not just from the food, but from the love and attention with which it had been prepared. The morning's exploration took her to a part of the forest she hadn't yet visited, following a path that wound through stands of aspen, whose bare branches created intricate calligraphy against the sky. The snow crunched softly beneath her snowshoes, the only sound in a world gone beautifully quiet, except for the whisper of her own breathing and the occasional soft thump of snow falling from overladen pine boughs. She discovered a small clearing where someone had built a simple meditation circle. 7 large stones arranged in a perfect ring, their surfaces worn smooth by weather and time. Snow filled the spaces between the stones and mounded gently on their tops. But their presence was unmistakable, speaking of others who had come to this place, seeking the same peace that had drawn her here. Elena brushed snow from one of the stones and settled onto its cold surface, feeling the winter seep through her layers until she was fully present with both warmth and cold, comfort and challenge. The forest arranged itself around her in a perfect mandala of peace, snow-heavy pines reaching toward a sky the color of pearls, bare deciduous trees creating lace patterns of shadow on white. The whole scene breathing with the kind of tranquility that makes prayer unnecessary, because existence itself becomes a form of worship. She sat for a long time, feeling her breath find rhythm with the vast, slow breathing of the forest around her. Sometimes her mind wandered to thoughts of the life she had temporarily left behind, emails accumulating in her inbox, deadlines approaching, colleagues probably wondering where she had gone. But these concerns felt increasingly distant, like memories of a dream that grows less substantial with each hour of waking. What felt real was this: the weight of snow-laden air in her lungs, the way silence could be more nourishing than any conversation, the gradual understanding that she had been living her life as if it were an emergency, when it was actually an opportunity to experience beauty and meaning in each unrepeatable moment. A movement in her peripheral vision drew her attention to a fox, picking its way delicately through the snow at the clearing's edge. Its red coat blazed against the white landscape, and its amber eyes held an intelligence that seemed ancient and knowing. For several minutes, woman and fox regarded each other across the clearing, not with wariness, but with the mutual respect of creatures sharing the same moment of peace. When the fox finally continued on its way, disappearing into the forest with the fluid grace of wild things perfectly adapted to their world, Elena felt blessed by the encounter. In the city, wildlife was almost entirely absent, except for the most adaptable urban survivors. Here, she was being welcomed into a community of beings who knew secrets about living that her busy, distracted life had never allowed her to discover. The walk back to the cabin took her through a grove of ancient pines, whose trunks rose like cathedral pillars, toward a canopy so thick it created its own weather system below. Snow had filtered down through the branches in patterns of light and shadow, creating a natural sanctuary that felt both intimate and infinite. Alina walked slowly through this forest temple, her footsteps muffled by snow, her heart opening to a sense of reverence she hadn't experienced since childhood. Lunch was a simple affair, soup and bread eaten by the fire, while she watched chickadees and nuthatches work the bird feeder outside the kitchen window. Their cheerful busyness provided a gentle contrast to the deep stillness that seemed to be taking up permanent residence in her chest. She was learning that peace wasn't static but dynamic, a living quality that could coexist with activity while transforming its meaning. The afternoon brought an unexpected gift, a visit from Margaret, who appeared at the door like a winter angel, her arms full of fresh provisions, and her face glowing with the kind of joy that comes from checking on someone you genuinely care about. "I thought you might enjoy some company," Margaret said, as Alina welcomed her inside. "And I've brought supplies for making bread." There's something about kneading dough on a winter afternoon that feeds more than just the body. They spent the next 2 hours in Margaret's gentle instruction, learning the alchemy that transforms simple ingredients into sustenance. The rhythm of kneading became meditation, their hands working the dough, while conversation flowed as naturally as breathing. Margaret shared stories of the cabin's previous guests, artists who had come seeking inspiration, executives who had arrived wound-tight and left walking softly, couples who had used the space to rediscover what they meant to each other beneath the accumulated debris of busy lives. "The mountain has its own way of teaching," Margaret said, as they shaped loaves for the oven. "It doesn't hurry anyone or force insights. It just holds space for whatever wants to emerge, like a loving grandmother who knows that healing happens in its own time." As the bread baked, filling the cabin with aromas that spoke of home and nurturing, Alina felt another layer of urban armor dissolving. Margaret's presence reminded her of connections that nourished rather than drained, of relationships based on genuine care rather than professional networking or social obligation. This was what human community could look like when it arose from love rather than necessity. Margaret stayed for dinner, sharing stories and laughter that felt like music after days of beautiful silence. They ate the fresh bread still warm from the oven, spread with butter and honey that tasted like captured sunshine. Outside, snow began to fall again, adding to the sense of intimate cocoon that surrounded their shared meal. "You're looking different," Margaret observed as they lingered over tea by the fire. "More settled, somehow. Less like you're carrying the weight of the world on your shoulders." Alina considered this, recognizing the truth in Margaret's words. "I think I'm remembering what it feels like to be still," she said. "Really still, not just physically, but in here." She touched her chest, where all the rushing and worrying usually lives. Margaret nodded with the understanding of someone who had walked this path herself. "The mountain teaches us that we don't have to earn peace," she said. "It's not a reward for good behavior or hard work. It's our natural state, always available when we stop long enough to remember." After Margaret's departure, the cabin felt even more precious for having been shared and blessed by friendship. Alina prepared for bed with the same deliberate attention she brought to all her evening rituals now, banking the fire so coals would glow through the night, lighting the oil lamp beside her bed, arranging tomorrow's clothes with the care of someone who had learned that every small act could be an expression of self-love. She wrote in her grandmother's journal by lamplight, the words flowing onto the page like water finding its course. "I am learning," she wrote, "that solitude is not about being alone, but about being alone with yourself in a way that feels complete rather than lacking. The silence here doesn't empty me. It fills me with awareness of all the life that moves beneath the surface of my ordinary consciousness." Outside her bedroom window, snow continued its ancient dance, each flake catching the lamplight like a tiny star before joining the growing blanket that covered the world in peace. The forest breathed around her in its vast, slow rhythm, and Alina felt herself held by something larger and more stable than any human institution. The eternal cycles of earth and season, the patient wisdom of trees that had weathered countless winters, the deep knowing that lived in places where silence was not broken, but cherished. That night, she dreamed of walking through forests where every tree was a prayer, where her footsteps left marks of gratitude in snow that had been falling since the beginning of time. In her dreams, the boundary between herself and the winter world dissolved, and she experienced the profound rest that comes from understanding that she belonged to something infinitely larger and more beautiful than her small, worried self. When she woke the next morning, she carried some of that dream piece with her into the waking world, feeling it settle into her bones like a blessing that had taken root and would remain with her long after she left this sanctuary. The transformation was not dramatic, but fundamental, a shift from seeking peace to recognizing that she had always been peaceful beneath all the noise and hurry that had convinced her otherwise. Chapter 6: The Deep Listening. On the 10th day of her retreat, Alina discovered that silence was not a single thing, but an entire universe of subtle variations, each carrying its own gifts and teachings. The silence of dawn held anticipation and possibility, while evening's quiet embraced completion and rest. Midday silence was full-bodied and warm, wrapping around the cabin like a grandmother's arms, while the deep silence of midnight felt infinite, connecting her small sanctuary to the vast mystery of stars and space. She had learned to read these different qualities of quiet the way others might read the weather, understanding that each carried information about the world's mood and the possibilities it offered. This morning's silence felt particularly rich, pregnant with the kind of potential that precedes transformation. Alina woke naturally as the first light touched the windows, her body finally synchronized with the rhythms of this place, where time moved according to the sun's arc rather than digital clocks. The fire had burned down to glowing embers, but the cabin retained its warmth, testament to the thoughtful engineering that had gone into creating this sanctuary, where comfort never required sacrifice of the natural world's beauty. Building up the fire had become a form of moving meditation. Each piece of kindling placed with reverence for the gift of warmth and light. As flames began to dance in the hearth, Alina felt the familiar sense of gratitude that marked all her mornings now. Thankfulness, not just for the obvious blessings of shelter and comfort, but for the more subtle gifts of time and silence, and the opportunity to remember who she was beneath all the roles and expectations that usually defined her. Coffee prepared with mountain spring water seemed to carry the essence of the landscape itself, and she carried her mug to the window where she had taken to beginning each day. The view never repeated itself exactly. Today, fog rose from Moonbeam Lake, creating a mystical landscape where trees appeared and disappeared like thoughts forming and dissolving in a peaceful mind. As she watched, the fog gradually lifted, revealing the lake's dark surface, reflecting the pastel colors of dawn. A beaver swam across the water, its wake spreading in a perfect V behind it, creating the only movement in an otherwise perfectly still world. Alina had learned to treasure these wildlife encounters, understanding that they were glimpses into a way of being that prioritized presence over productivity, survival over accumulation. Breakfast had evolved into a practice of mindful nourishment, each meal prepared and consumed with attention that bordered on worship. This morning, she made pancakes again, but the familiar recipe had become a meditation on transformation. Flour and eggs and milk combining to create something entirely new. The way experience and reflection were combining to create a new version of herself. The morning's exploration led her to a section of forest she had noticed, but not yet visited, where a small creek wound between snow-covered banks. The water moved slowly, not yet frozen despite the cold, its gentle murmur providing the day's only soundtrack besides the whisper of wind in the pines and her own steady breathing. Alina followed the creek upstream, her snowshoes finding sure footing on the path that paralleled the water. The walking meditation that had developed naturally over the past week carried her forward with no particular destination in mind. Each step an opportunity to practice the fox's fluid grace, the heron's patient awareness. She discovered that winter had transformed the creek into a gallery of natural art. Ice had formed fantastic sculptures where the water slowed or pooled, creating crystal formations that caught the morning light and threw it back in tiny rainbows. Snow had collected on rocks and fallen logs to create arrangements that seemed designed by some cosmic artist with an eye for perfect composition. A fallen pine had created a natural bridge across the creek, its bark worn smooth by weather and time. Alina tested its stability carefully before crossing, feeling like a character in a fairy tale as she walked across running water on a bridge that had been crafted by wind and weather rather than human hands. On the far side, she found a natural shelter formed by overlapping branches heavy with snow. A perfect reading nook that seemed to have been waiting specifically for her discovery. She had brought her grandmother's journal and a pencil, thinking she might write, but instead found herself simply sitting in the natural shelter and listening. Not listening for anything specific, but practicing the kind of deep listening that Margaret had mentioned, opening her awareness to layers of sound and silence that were always present, but usually ignored. At first, she heard only the obvious: the creek's gentle conversation with its banks, the wind moving through different types of trees with subtly different voices, the occasional call of a bird in the distance. But as she settled deeper into stillness, other sounds emerged. The almost inaudible sound of snow settling on branches, the whisper of her own heartbeat, the vast background silence that held all other sounds like a mother holding sleeping children. And beneath even these, something else, not a sound exactly, but a sense of aliveness that seemed to emanate from the forest itself. Alina had read about indigenous peoples who spoke of the earth as a living being, but this was her first direct experience of what they might have meant. The forest felt conscious, aware, breathing with a rhythm so slow and deep that it took complete stillness to perceive it. She sat in her natural shelter for nearly 2 hours, not meditating in any formal sense, but simply being present with whatever arose in the field of her awareness. Thoughts came and went like clouds across sky, memories of conversations she needed to have when she returned to the city, glimpses of projects she wanted to pursue, fleeting anxieties about responsibilities waiting for her attention. But instead of engaging with these thoughts or being carried away by them, she found herself watching them with the same gentle interest she brought to observing the chickadees at the bird feeder. They were simply phenomena, arising and passing away in the vast space of awareness, no more substantial than the fog that had lifted from the lake that morning. This was a new way of relating to her own mind, not fighting its activity or trying to empty it, but discovering the spaciousness that contained all thoughts and feelings without being defined by any of them. It was like finding out that she was the sky rather than the weather, vast enough to hold storms and sunshine with equal grace. When she finally rose from her forest seat, Alina felt as if she had been touched by something ancient and healing. Her body moved with a different quality of relaxation, and her breathing had settled into the kind of deep rhythm she usually only experienced in the moments before sleep. The walk back to the cabin felt like floating rather than walking, each step connecting her to the earth with newfound intimacy. Lunch was prepared and consumed with the same meditative attention she brought to all activities now. But the food seemed to nourish her more completely than usual, perhaps because her morning of deep listening had opened her to receive not just the nutrients in the soup and bread, but the love and care with which Margaret had provisioned the cabin, the sunshine that had grown the vegetables, the rain that had watered the grain. The afternoon brought an unexpected visitor, not a person this time, but a snowy owl that landed in the large pine outside the great room window. Alina had never seen such a magnificent bird up close, its white and brown plumage making it nearly invisible against the snow-covered branches, until movement revealed its presence. The owl sat perfectly still for nearly an hour, occasionally turning its great head to survey the forest with eyes that seemed to hold ancient wisdom. Alina felt honored by its presence, understanding that she was being visited by a creature that belonged to a different order of existence, one where patience was not a virtue to be cultivated, but a natural way of being. When the owl finally spread its massive wings and lifted off with barely a sound, Alina felt as if she had been blessed by wildness itself. The encounter left her feeling even more connected to the intricate web of life that surrounded her, more aware of herself as one small part of a much larger living system. That evening, she prepared dinner with unusual ceremony, as if cooking for a beloved guest rather than just herself. She was beginning to understand that how she treated herself in solitude revealed something important about her relationship with life itself. When she prepared food with love and attention, when she built up the fire with reverence, when she moved through the cabin with grace and gratitude, she was practicing a form of self-love that had nothing to do with indulgence and everything to do with recognizing her own inherent worth. After dinner, she settled by the fire with her grandmother's journal. But instead of writing immediately, she simply sat and felt the day's experiences settling into memory. The morning's deep listening had opened something in her that remained present even now, a quality of inner spaciousness that made everything feel less urgent, less overwhelming. When she finally began to write, the words came from a deeper place than usual, flowing onto the page with the same effortless grace as water flowing downstream. "I am learning," she wrote. "That peace is not a state to be achieved, but a dimension to be recognized. It has been here all along, waiting beneath the surface of my busy thoughts and endless plans. Winter is teaching me to listen for it, to rest in it, to let it guide my movements and color my perceptions." Outside, snow began to fall again. Its soft percussion against the windows creating a lullaby that seemed composed specifically for this moment. The fire danced in the hearth, painting the cabin's walls with moving shadows that made the whole space feel alive with gentle energy. Alina felt held by the night's embrace, surrounded by a peace so complete that it seemed to emanate from her very bones. As she prepared for bed, moving through her evening rituals with the slow grace that had become natural to her, Alina realized that something fundamental had shifted in her relationship with solitude. She no longer experienced it as an absence of company, of stimulation, of the familiar distractions that had once seemed necessary for contentment. Instead, solitude had revealed itself as a presence, rich and full and infinitely nourishing. That night, she fell asleep to the sound of snow, adding its whispered commentary to the night's peaceful symphony. In her dreams, she walked through forests where listening was a form of prayer, and silence was a teacher that required no words to convey its deepest wisdom. She dreamed of owls whose eyes reflected the light of stars, of creeks that carried the songs of mountains to the sea, of a world where every moment offered the possibility of communion with the sacred. When she woke the next morning, some of that dream wisdom remained with her, settling into her waking consciousness like sediment carried by a gentle river. She was beginning to understand that the transformation happening within her was not something she was creating through effort or technique, but something she was allowing by finally becoming still enough to hear the voice of peace that had been speaking to her all along. Chapter 7: The Gift of Solitude. 2 weeks into her retreat, Alina had begun to understand that solitude was not just the absence of other people, but a presence unto itself, a living, breathing entity that had been waiting patiently for her attention. This presence had been with her all along, hidden beneath the constant noise and activity of her former life. But here, in the embrace of winter silence, it had finally found space to to reveal itself. She woke this morning to a world transformed by freezing rain that had fallen during the night, coating every surface with a crystal shell that turned the forest into a palace of ice. Each pine needle was encased in its own perfect prism, every branch outlined in glass that caught the early sunlight and scattered it into tiny rainbows. The entire landscape sparkled with an otherworldly beauty that took her breath away. Standing at the bedroom window with her morning coffee, Alina felt as if she had awakened inside a fairy tale. The ice coating made even the humblest twig into a work of art, while the larger trees had become crystal cathedrals that reached toward a sky so blue it seemed painted by angels. A gentle breeze moved through this transformed world, creating a symphony of tiny chimes as ice-coated branches touched and sang together. The beauty was so overwhelming that she felt tears gather in her eyes, not from sadness, but from a kind of gratitude so profound it had no words. When had she last been moved to tears by simple beauty? When had the sight of sunlight on ice been enough to crack her heart open with wonder? The ice storm had given her a gift she hadn't known she was missing, the ability to be astonished by the world's generosity. Building up the fire felt especially sacred this morning, as if she was creating warmth and light as an offering to match the crystal beauty that surrounded the cabin. Each flame that caught and danced seemed to be responding to the ice palace beyond the windows, fire and ice, creating a perfect balance of elements that spoke to some ancient harmony. Breakfast became a meditation on contrast. The warmth of oatmeal against the cold beauty, visible through every window. The simple nourishment of honey and fruit against the complex artistry that nature had painted overnight. Alina ate slowly, pausing frequently to gaze at the transformed landscape, feeling herself being fed by beauty as much as by food. She had planned to snowshoe to the meditation circle this morning, but the ice coating made the forest too treacherous for safe travel. Instead of feeling disappointed, she discovered that confinement to the cabin felt like another gift, an invitation to explore the interior landscape with the same attention she had been giving to the forest. The morning unfolded with the unhurried grace that had become her natural rhythm. She read poetry by the fire, letting each line settle into her consciousness like seeds finding fertile ground. She wrote in her grandmother's journal, the words flowing with increasing ease as she gave voice to the transformation happening in the quiet depths of her being. She prepared and ate lunch with the ceremonial attention she brought to all activities now, recognizing that how she moved through even the simplest tasks revealed her relationship with life itself. But it was in the afternoon that solitude revealed its deepest gift. Alina was sitting by the fire, neither reading nor writing, but simply being present with the dance of flames and the music of ice wind in the trees, when she experienced something she had never felt before: complete and perfect contentment with her own company. This was different from the loneliness she had sometimes felt in crowded places, different from the restless searching that had driven her from activity to activity in her former life. This was a deep recognition that she was complete unto herself, not in the sense of needing nothing from others, but in the understanding that her own presence was sufficient to create richness and meaning. The revelation was so simple and yet so profound that she actually laughed out loud, the sound surprising her in the cabin's gentle quiet. She was enough. She had always been enough. All the seeking and striving and trying to become something other than what she was had been based on a fundamental misunderstanding. She was not a problem to be solved or a project to be completed. She was a miracle to be experienced, a consciousness capable of finding wonder in ice crystals and peace in silence, and love in the simple fact of being alive. As this understanding settled into her bones, Alina felt something that had been tightly held in her chest for years finally relax and release. The constant background anxiety that had colored so much of her adult life, the sense that she should be doing more, being more, achieving more, simply dissolved like morning mist touched by sunlight. In its place arose a quality of presence she had only glimpsed before in rare moments of meditation or prayer. But this was different from those brief experiences, because it felt sustainable, integrated, as natural as breathing. She was not trying to be present. She simply was present, as inherently as trees are tall or water is wet. The afternoon light filtered through the ice-coated windows, creating patterns of refracted beauty that shifted and changed as the sun moved across the sky. Alina watched these light patterns play across the cabin walls with the same fascination she might once have brought to entertainment or social media, but without the restless quality that had characterized her former distractions. This was pure appreciation, unmarred by the need for something more or different. She understood now why her grandmother had spoken of winter as nature's way of teaching rest. This was not the rest of exhaustion or escape, but the rest of completion, the deep satisfaction that comes from finally arriving in one's own life instead of constantly running toward some imaginary better version of it. As evening approached, Alina prepared dinner with unusual ceremony, as if cooking for royalty rather than just herself. But she was beginning to understand that she was royalty, not in any hierarchical sense, but in the recognition that consciousness itself is precious beyond measure. that the ability to experience beauty and love and wonder is the greatest treasure in any kingdom. She ate by candlelight and firelight, the ice-covered world beyond the windows glittering like a universe of stars. Each bite was savored, each moment of warmth and flavor received as a gift. This was what the mystics meant when they spoke of finding the sacred in the ordinary. Not that ordinary things became supernatural, but that they revealed the miracle they had always been. After dinner, she settled by the fire with her grandmother's journal. But instead of writing immediately, she simply sat with the profound contentment that filled her like warm honey. Outside, the ice-coated trees sang their crystal songs in the evening breeze, and the fire danced with ancient energy that connected her to all the humans who had ever found comfort in flame's gift of warmth and light. When she finally began to write, the words came from a place of such deep peace that they seemed to write themselves. "I have found it," she wrote. "The thing I was looking for without knowing its name. Not a thing, really, but a way of being that feels like coming home to myself. Solitude has taught me that I am already everything I was trying to become. Whole, complete, worthy of love, simply by virtue of existing." The ice storm continued through the night, but its wild music only served to make the cabin feel more precious, more like a sanctuary carved out of winter's heart by hands that understood the deep human need for beauty and peace. Alina fell asleep to the sound of crystal branches singing in the wind, her dreams filled with images of ice palaces and fire temples, of a world where every surface reflected light, and every moment offered the possibility of wonder. When she woke the next morning, the storm had passed, leaving behind a landscape so beautiful it seemed to exist in a realm beyond ordinary reality. The sun emerged from behind dispersing clouds to set the entire ice-covered world ablaze with light. Each tree and bush and blade of grass transformed into a prism that scattered rainbows across the snow. Alina stood at her bedroom window, coffee warming her hands, and felt her heart expand with a joy so pure it seemed to lift her entire being toward the sky. This was what her grandmother had meant about winter's gifts. Not just the obvious beauty of snow and ice, but the way winter's challenges could strip away everything unnecessary and reveal the essential miracle of being alive and aware in a world of infinite wonder. The morning unfolded with the same ceremonial attention she brought to all her days now. But there was something different in the quality of her movements, her thoughts, her very breathing. The contentment she had discovered yesterday had deepened overnight, settling into her bones like a blessing that had taken permanent residence in the core of her being. As she prepared breakfast, Alina realized that she was experiencing something she had read about but never truly understood. the peace that passes understanding. It wasn't dependent on circumstances or achievements or the approval of others. It wasn't something she had to maintain or protect or earn. It simply was, as natural and constant as the circulation of her blood or the beating of her heart. The day passed in a haze of simple activities made sacred by the quality of attention she brought to them. She read by the fire, but the words seemed to arise from the same deep place of wisdom that was speaking in her own heart. She cooked and cleaned and tended the fire, but each task felt like a form of prayer, a way of expressing gratitude for the gift of life and consciousness and the opportunity to experience such profound peace. As afternoon faded toward evening, Alina found herself drawn to the writing desk by the bedroom window, where her grandmother's journal lay open to fresh pages. She had been chronicling her experiences throughout her stay, but tonight felt different, not like documentation, but like testimony. A witness to transformation that felt both deeply personal and universally relevant. "I understand now," she wrote, "why the great teachers spoke of finding the kingdom of heaven within. It was never about escaping the world, but about discovering the peace that lives at the center of all experience, waiting to be recognized. Winter has been my teacher, solitude my guide, and silence my companion on this journey back to myself." Outside her window, the ice-covered world caught the last light of day and threw it back in brilliant flashes that made her eyes water with their beauty. But now she understood that the real beauty was not in the landscape, but in her capacity to perceive it, to be moved by it, to find in it a reflection of the same miraculous awareness that was reading these words, that was breathing this breath, that was experiencing this perfect moment of being alive. The fire crackled in the great room, its light and warmth calling her back to the heart of her temporary home. Alina closed the journal and made her way to the chair that had become her evening sanctuary, settling into its embrace with the deep satisfaction of someone who had finally learned the difference between being busy and being alive. As night settled over the mountain and stars emerged in a sky swept clean by the passing storm, Alina sat by the fire and felt the profound completeness that had become her constant companion. Tomorrow would bring new gifts, new opportunities to practice presence and gratitude. But tonight, in this moment, she was exactly where she belonged, exactly who she was meant to be, held by a peace that had been waiting for her recognition all along. Chapter 8: The Deep Restoring. The third week of Alina's retreat began with a morning so still, it seemed the entire world was holding its breath in meditation. The ice storm had passed, leaving the forest transformed into a crystal cathedral where every surface caught and multiplied the early light. But beneath the spectacular beauty, Alina sensed something deeper happening, a quality of restoration that went beyond rest or relaxation into something that felt like spiritual rebirth. She woke without an alarm, her body completely synchronized now with the rhythms of this place, where time moved according to the sun's arc, and the moon's phases rather than digital displays. The sleep she experienced here was different from any rest she had known, not the heavy unconsciousness that comes from exhaustion, but the light, healing sleep of a body and mind finally free from the chronic tension of always being slightly ahead of or behind the present moment. The fire had burned down to glowing coals during the night, but the cabin retained its warmth, wrapping around her like a loving embrace that required nothing but acceptance. Building up the fire had become such a natural ritual that her hands moved without conscious direction, placing kindling and logs with the intuitive grace of someone who had remembered an ancient skill buried deep in genetic memory. Coffee prepared in the pre-dawn quiet carried the essence of mountains and morning, and Alina carried her mug to the great room's largest window to witness the daily miracle of sunrise, painting the ice-covered world. A great horned owl sat in the pine tree closest to the cabin, its amber eyes catching the first light like twin flames. They regarded each other for long minutes, woman and wild creature sharing the profound intimacy that comes from mutual respect and the absence of fear. When the owl finally lifted off on silent wings, disappearing into the forest depths like a spirit returning to its realm, Alina felt blessed by its presence. These encounters with wildlife had become daily gifts, reminders that she was not alone in this sanctuary, but part of a larger community of beings who knew secrets about living that her busy, distracted life had never allowed her to discover. The morning unfolded with the unhurried grace that had become as natural as breathing. Breakfast prepared and consumed with ceremonial attention. Pages read by firelight that seemed to carry wisdom directly into her heart. Words written in her grandmother's journal that flowed like water, finding its natural course. But beneath all these activities, Alina sensed something profound occurring in the deepest levels of her being. The restoration she was experiencing was not simply the recovery from fatigue or stress, though those healings were certainly part of it. This was something more fundamental, a remembering of her essential nature that had been obscured by years of living according to external demands and expectations. Layer by layer, winter's patient teaching was dissolving the accumulated debris of a life lived out of harmony with her deepest truth. Around midday, Alina found herself drawn to the meditation circle in the forest. even though the ice-covered trails made travel treacherous. She moved carefully through the transformed landscape, her snowshoes finding secure footing on the crystal-coated path. Each step a practice in mindful navigation of challenging terrain. The forest had become an art gallery of impossible beauty. Every pine needle was encased in its own perfect prism, every branch outlined in glass that caught the filtered sunlight and scattered it into tiny rainbows. The sound of her snowshoes on the ice-crusted snow created a gentle percussion that seemed to harmonize with the whisper of wind through crystal branches and the distant call of ravens echoing through the winter air. When she reached the meditation circle, Alina found that snow and ice had transformed the 7 stones into something that looked carved by celestial artists. She brushed ice from one stone's surface and settled onto its cold stability, feeling winter's clarity seep through her layers until she was fully present with both comfort and challenge, warmth and cold, the human and the elemental. As she sat in the circle, surrounded by the ice palace that the forest had become, Alina felt herself settling into a depth of stillness she had never experienced. This was not the emptiness that comes from the absence of thought, but the fullness that emerges when thinking becomes spacious enough to hold all experience without grasping or resistance. Time seemed to dissolve as she sat there, her breathing synchronized with the vast, slow rhythm of the forest around her. Sometimes thoughts arose, memories of her life before this retreat, glimpses of possibilities that might unfold when she returned to the world, questions about how to integrate what she was learning here into her daily existence. But instead of being carried away by these mental movements, she found herself observing them with the same gentle interest she brought to watching birds at the feeder or clouds moving across the sky. This was the deepest teaching of her winter retreat. The discovery that she was not her thoughts or feelings or circumstances, but the awareness in which all these experiences arose and passed away. This awareness was vast and peaceful and unshakable, always present, but usually obscured by the constant activity of a mind that had been trained to seek satisfaction in the future rather than rest in the eternal now. When Alina finally rose from her stone seat, the sun had moved considerably across the sky, though she had no sense of time passing. Her body felt both deeply relaxed and vibrantly alive, as if every cell had been bathed in the healing light of pure presence. The walk back to the cabin was like floating through a crystal dream, each step connecting her to the earth with newfound intimacy and grace. Lunch became another opportunity to practice the kind of mindful nourishment that fed more than just the body. Alina prepared soup with vegetables from Margaret's provisions, stirring clockwise while she watched steam rise in spirals that seemed to connect her small kitchen to the vast sky beyond the windows. Each spoonful was received with gratitude, not just for its warmth and flavor, but for the entire web of relationships that had brought this nourishment to her. Sunshine and rain, soil and seeds, the caring hands that had planted and tended and harvested. The afternoon brought a visitor she hadn't expected. Margaret herself, arriving on cross-country skis with a backpack full of provisions and a face glowing with the kind of joy that comes from moving through winter landscapes under one's own power. "I couldn't resist checking on you after the ice storm," Margaret said, as Alina welcomed her inside, stamping snow from her skis before propping them against the cabin's wall. "And I wanted to bring fresh bread and some special tea that's perfect for this stage of a retreat." They spent the afternoon in comfortable conversation, sharing stories and observations, while the ice-covered world sparkled beyond the windows. Margaret had an intuitive understanding of where Alina was in her process of renewal, asking questions that invited reflection rather than requiring performance, offering insights that landed like seeds in fertile ground. "You're moving differently," Margaret observed as they prepared tea together in the kitchen. "More like you're dancing with each moment rather than marching through it. That's what happens when we stop trying to get somewhere and start arriving where we are." The tea Margaret had brought was a blend of herbs that seemed designed specifically for the deep winter of the soul, roots and berries that tasted of earth and patience, leaves that carried the essence of plants that knew how to survive and thrive in the most challenging conditions. As they sipped the warming brew by the fire, Alina felt another layer of urban armor dissolving, revealing more of the tender, authentic self that had been waiting beneath all the protective strategies she had developed over the years. "The mountain has been teaching me," Alina said, her voice carrying the soft quality that comes from spending time in silence. "About rest that isn't empty but full, about peace that doesn't require anything to be different than it is, about the kind of solitude that connects rather than isolates." Margaret nodded with the understanding of someone who had walked this path herself. "Winter is the earth's way of going inward," she said. "Everything that's not essential falls away, and what remains is the core truth that was there all along. You're remembering who you are beneath all the stories about who you're supposed to be." After Margaret's departure, the cabin felt even more blessed, charged with the energy of genuine human connection that nourished rather than drained. Alina prepared dinner with unusual ceremony, as if cooking for the most honored guest, which she was beginning to understand. She was. Her own presence had become precious to her, worthy of the same care and attention she would offer to a beloved friend. As evening settled over the mountain, Alina found herself drawn once again to her grandmother's journal. But tonight, instead of writing about her experiences, she felt called to write to her grandmother directly, as if the journal were a bridge across time that allowed conversation with the wise woman who had first taught her about winter's gifts. "Dear Grandmama," she wrote, and immediately felt a presence that was both memory and something more substantial settling around her like a warm shawl. "I am finally understanding what you meant about winter teaching us to rest. I thought rest was about not doing anything, but I'm learning it's about doing everything from a place of peace instead of a place of fear." The words flowed onto the page like water finding its course, carrying not just thoughts, but emotions and insights that seemed to arise from a source deeper than her individual mind. She wrote about the transformation happening in the deepest levels of her being, about the way silence had revealed itself as fullness rather than emptiness, about the profound contentment that had taken up residence in her heart. "I think I'm finally ready to come home," she wrote, and realized she meant both returning to her life in the city and returning to herself. "Not because I have to, but because I want to bring this peace into the world, to live from this place of rest, and let it inform everything I do." Outside her window, the ice-covered forest caught the light of stars and moon, creating a world that seemed to exist in a realm beyond ordinary reality. But Alina understood now that this beauty was not separate from ordinary life. It was ordinary life revealed in its true magnificence, waiting to be recognized by eyes that had learned to see clearly, and hearts that had remembered how to rest in wonder. That night, she fell asleep to the sound of ice crystals singing in the winter wind, her dreams filled with images of returning to the world, not as someone who had escaped, but as someone who had remembered, carrying the mountain's peace like a seed that would grow wherever she planted it with love and attention. When she woke the next morning, Alina felt the deep satisfaction that comes from a process of healing that has reached completion. She was ready for the next phase of her journey, not because the retreat had ended, but because she had found what she came seeking, the unshakable peace that had been waiting at the center of her being all along. Chapter 9: Integration and Homecoming. The final days of Alina's retreat arrived with the gentle inevitability of seasons changing, carrying both the sadness of endings and the excitement of new beginnings. 3 weeks ago, she had arrived at Whisperwind Cabin, carrying the weight of a life lived out of harmony with her deepest nature. Now, as she prepared to return to the world, she felt like a different person, inhabiting the same body, lighter, clearer, rooted in a peace that felt as natural and constant as her heartbeat. The morning dawned clear and bright, the ice from the recent storm beginning to melt in the strengthening sun, creating a symphony of tiny waterfalls as crystal coatings released their hold on branches and eaves. Alina woke naturally, her body's rhythm perfectly synchronized with the mountain's ancient patterns, and lay for a moment listening to the music of melting ice, nature's way of demonstrating that even the most dramatic transformations could happen with grace and beauty. Building up the fire had become such an integral part of her morning ritual that she couldn't imagine beginning a day any other way. Each piece of kindling placed with intention, each breath that coaxed flames to life, feeling like a prayer of gratitude for the gifts of warmth and light, and another opportunity to experience the miracle of consciousness. The fire caught and danced with familiar energy, its light playing across log walls that had become as dear to her as the walls of a childhood home. Coffee prepared in the French press had evolved far beyond mere caffeine delivery into something approaching communion. Alina carried her mug to the great room's eastern window, where she had taken to greeting each dawn for the past 3 weeks, and watched the sun paint the melting landscape with shades of gold and rose. A red-winged blackbird perched on a fence post at the meadow's edge, its bright shoulder patches flashing like small flames as it sang the complex song that announced territory and availability, and the simple joy of being alive on a beautiful morning. As she watched the bird and felt the sun's growing warmth through the window, Alina experienced one of those moments of perfect contentment that had become increasingly frequent during her stay. Not contentment with her circumstances, though those were certainly pleasant, but contentment with existence itself. The profound satisfaction that comes from recognizing that this moment, exactly as it is, lacks nothing and requires nothing to be perfect. Breakfast became a meditation on impermanence and gratitude. This was one of her last mornings in this sanctuary, one of the final opportunities to prepare oatmeal on the wood-burning stove while watching chickadees work the bird feeder outside the kitchen window. Instead of sadness at the approaching end, Alina felt a deep appreciation for the temporary nature of all experiences, the way their brevity made them more precious rather than less meaningful. The morning's exploration took her once more to the meditation circle, but this time she went not as a seeker looking for something outside herself, but as someone saying farewell to a place that had served as midwife to her own rebirth. The forest path was treacherous with melting ice, requiring careful attention to each step. But this only enhanced the sense of pilgrimage that characterized the walk. When she reached the circle of stones, Alina found that the morning sun had melted most of the ice coating, revealing their natural surfaces like the unveiling of ancient teachers who had been waiting patiently for recognition. She settled onto her usual stone and felt immediately grounded, connected to all the mornings she had spent here learning to be still, to listen, to rest in the vast awareness that was her true nature. As she sat in the circle, surrounded by the slowly melting forest, Alina felt the integration happening that marks the completion of any profound learning process. The insights and experiences of the past 3 weeks were settling into her bones, becoming not just memories, but part of her cellular knowledge, woven into the fabric of who she was rather than remaining as external concepts to be remembered. She understood now that the peace she had found here was not dependent on external circumstances, not on the cabin or the forest or the absence of urban pressures. It was a quality of being that she could access anywhere, in any situation, because it lived at the core of awareness itself. The mountain had not given her this peace. It had simply provided the silence and space necessary for her to recognize what had always been there. This recognition brought with it a profound sense of homecoming that had nothing to do with location. Alina felt herself settling into herself with the deep satisfaction of someone who had been searching for home in all the wrong places and finally discovered it was where she had been standing all along. She was home in her own skin, home in her own heart, home in the very fact of being alive and aware in a world of infinite beauty. When she finally rose from the stone circle, Alina felt complete rather than finished, not because her growth was over, but because she had found the unshakable foundation from which all further growth could proceed. The walk back to the cabin was like floating through a world made new by her transformed perception. Each step connecting her to the earth with the intimate grace of someone who belonged exactly where she was. The afternoon was spent in the gentle tasks of preparing for departure, not the frantic packing that had characterized so many endings in her former life, but the slow, ceremonial process of someone honoring a sacred transition. Each item she folded into her suitcase carried the memory of how it had served her during her retreat. The softest sweaters that had wrapped her in comfort during long evenings by the fire, the well-worn jeans that had moved with her body like old friends through forest paths and around the cabin. Her grandmother's journal had grown thick with pages of reflection and discovery, its leather cover now carrying the patina of intimate use. As Alina packed it carefully among her other belongings, she felt as if she was carrying a piece of her grandmother's wisdom forward into her own life, continuing a conversation that transcended time and death. Margaret arrived in the late afternoon, appearing at the door with perfect timing and the kind of smile that suggested she had been sensing Alina's readiness for transition. They spent the evening together preparing a farewell dinner that was also a celebration, not of ending, but of transformation, not of departure, but of integration. "You're taking it with you," Margaret said, as they cooked together in the kitchen that had become such a source of nourishment and peace. The real sanctuary was never this place. It was what you found inside yourself. The cabin just provided the silence you needed to hear it. They ate by candlelight and firelight, their meal accompanied by stories and laughter that felt like music after weeks of beautiful silence. Margaret shared wisdom from her years of hosting guests who came to the mountain seeking renewal. And Alina found herself able to articulate the transformation she had undergone with a clarity that surprised her. "I came here exhausted," Alina said, her voice carrying the soft quality that comes from extended time in silence. Not just tired from work, but soul tired from living a life that felt like it belonged to someone else. "I'm leaving with energy I didn't know I possessed. But it's not the frantic energy of always trying to get somewhere. It's the quiet energy that comes from finally arriving where you are." Margaret nodded with the understanding of someone who had witnessed this transformation many times. "The mountain teaches us that we don't have to earn peace," she said. "It's our birthright, always available when we stop long enough to remember. You've remembered, and now you get to spend the rest of your life living from that remembering." After Margaret's departure, Alina spent her final evening by the fire, not writing in her journal, but simply sitting in appreciation for all that had transpired in this sanctuary. The flames danced with familiar energy, their light playing across walls that had witnessed her transformation from a woman fleeing exhaustion to someone returning to the world with gifts to offer. She banked the fire carefully for her final night, ensuring that coals would glow through the darkness and be ready to welcome the morning. This small act of care for the fire that had been her constant companion felt like the completion of a sacred contract. She had been cared for by this place, and she was caring for it in return. That night, Alina fell asleep to the familiar symphony of winter sounds, wind in the pines, the settling of logs in the cabin's walls, the distant call of an owl hunting in the moonlit forest. But these sounds no longer felt external to her. They had become part of her inner landscape, voices that would continue to speak to her long after she had left their physical presence. Her dreams were filled with images of integration, the mountain's peace flowing like water into the landscapes of her ordinary life, transforming meetings and meals and commutes into opportunities for presence and grace. She dreamed of carrying winter's wisdom into spring's activity, of living in the world while remaining rooted in the unshakable peace she had found at the center of herself. When she woke on her final morning at Whisperwind Cabin, Alina felt ready for the next chapter of her journey, not because the retreat had ended, but because she had become someone who could carry sanctuary with her wherever she went, creating peace not as a destination to reach, but as a quality of being to embody in each moment of her precious, wild, and beautiful life. Chapter 10: The Return Transformed. Alina's final morning at Whisperwind Cabin dawned with the kind of ethereal beauty that seems designed by the universe as a perfect farewell gift. The air was crystal clear, so pure it seemed to sing as it filled her lungs, and the sun rose through a sky painted in shades of rose and gold that transformed the snow-covered landscape into something that belonged more to dream than ordinary reality. She woke without sadness, though this would be her last sleep in the four-poster bed that had cradled so many nights of healing rest. Instead, she felt the deep satisfaction that comes from a process that has reached natural completion, not because time had run out, but because what needed to happen had happened. She had come seeking rest and found transformation, arrived as a refugee from her own life, and emerged as someone ready to live with intention and grace. The ritual of building up the fire held special poignancy this morning, each piece of kindling placed with extra care, each breath that coaxed flames to life, feeling like a final offering to the hearth that had been the heart of her sanctuary. The fire caught and danced with familiar energy, its light playing across log walls that had witnessed her gradual return to herself, warming air that had held her prayers and tears and moments of profound recognition. Coffee prepared in the French press for the last time carried flavors of completion and gratitude. Alina carried her mug to the great room's eastern window, where she had greeted each dawn for 3 weeks, and watched the sun paint farewell colors across the landscape that had become as dear to her as childhood's most treasured memories. A pair of cardinals flashed red against the white snow, their brilliant presence seeming to celebrate her transformation and bless her upcoming journey. Breakfast became a ceremonial meal, each bite of oatmeal sweetened with local honey, carrying the essence of mountain meadows and careful tending. Alina ate slowly, not to delay departure, but to fully receive this final gift of mindful nourishment in a place where every meal had become communion with peace itself. The chickadees worked the bird feeder outside the kitchen window with their usual cheerful efficiency, and she found herself smiling at their persistent optimism, a quality she realized she now carried within herself. The morning's final exploration took her once more to the meditation circle. But this journey felt different from all the others, not a seeking, but a completion, not a question, but an answer embodied in her very presence, on the forest path. She moved through the winter landscape with the fluid grace of someone who had learned to dance with each moment rather than struggle against circumstances. Her snowshoes finding sure footing on terrain that had become as familiar as the rhythms of her own breathing. The forest seemed to glow from within this morning, each tree and branch outlined with clarity that made ordinary perception feel like seeing for the first time. Alina understood that this enhanced perception was not a gift of the landscape, but a gift of her transformed awareness. The world had not become more beautiful, but she had become more awake to the beauty that had always been present. When she reached the circle of stones, Alina found them warmed by morning sunlight, their surfaces inviting rather than challenging. She settled onto her usual stone and felt immediately at home, not with this particular place, but with the quality of stillness and presence that the place had taught her to recognize within herself. This was the deepest gift of her retreat, discovering that sanctuary was not a location, but a way of being that she could access anywhere. As she sat in the circle for the last time, surrounded by the forest that had been her teacher and companion, Alina felt the profound integration that marks the completion of any authentic spiritual journey. The insights and experiences of the past 3 weeks were no longer separate events to be remembered, but part of her cellular knowledge, woven into the fabric of her being like threads in a tapestry that would grow more beautiful with time. She understood now that she was not the same person who had arrived at this cabin 3 weeks ago, fleeing exhaustion and disconnection. That woman had been like a bird with clipped wings, beautiful, but unable to access her own capacity for flight. This woman, the one sitting peacefully in morning sunlight, with cardinals calling from nearby trees, knew herself to be whole and complete, capable of both solitude and connection, work and rest, engagement and withdrawal, as circumstances required. When Alina finally rose from the stone circle, she did not say goodbye, because she understood that what she had found here was not being left behind, but carried forward. The mountain's peace lived now in her bones. Winter's wisdom flowed in her blood, and the sanctuary she had discovered in solitude had become a portable source of renewal that no external circumstances could touch. The walk back to the cabin was like floating through a world made luminous by recognition. Every tree seemed to nod farewell. Every bird call felt like blessing. Every step connected her to the earth with the intimate gratitude of someone who had remembered her place in the vast web of life. She was not leaving home, but carrying it with her. Not ending a retreat, but beginning a new way of living that honored both action and rest, both service and silence. Margaret arrived just as Alina was finishing her packing, appearing with the perfect timing that had characterized all their interactions. She brought fresh coffee and homemade pastries for the journey ahead. But more importantly, she brought the kind of presence that celebrates transformation without trying to hold on to it. "You're ready," Margaret said simply, her words carrying the authority of someone who had witnessed countless journeys of renewal and could recognize authentic completion when she saw it. Not ready to go back to your old life, but ready to live your life in a completely new way. They shared coffee and conversation by the fire one last time, their words flowing with the easy intimacy of friends who had always known each other. Alina found herself able to articulate her transformation with a clarity that surprised her, speaking not just about what had happened, but about how she planned to integrate these gifts into her return to the world. "I'm not afraid of going back," Alina said, her voice carrying the quiet confidence that comes from unshakable inner knowing. "I used to think I had to choose between peace and engagement, between caring for myself and serving others. Now I understand that real service flows from fullness rather than emptiness, that I can only give what I truly have." Margaret smiled with the satisfaction of a gardener watching a carefully tended seed finally burst into bloom. "The mountain has taught you its greatest secret," she said, "that you are already everything you need to be. Now, you get to spend the rest of your life living from that truth instead of trying to find it." As the time for departure approached, Alina moved through the cabin one final time, not to gather belongings, but to offer gratitude to each space that had served her transformation. The kitchen, where she had learned to prepare meals as acts of love. The writing desk, where words had flowed like water from a deep spring. The bedroom, where she had experienced the healing sleep of someone finally at peace with herself. The great room where fire had taught her about the sacred nature of warmth and light. She stood before the fireplace for a long moment, watching flames dance with the ancient energy that connects all life to its source. This fire had been her constant companion, witnessing her tears and laughter, warming her body and soul through the deepest winter of her transformation. Now it would continue burning for future guests who would come seeking their own renewal. Part of an endless cycle of offering and receiving that made the cabin a true sanctuary. Her car was loaded with the same possessions she had brought 3 weeks ago, but everything felt transformed by her changed relationship to herself and her life. The books she had packed were the same volumes, but she was now someone who could receive their wisdom rather than simply collect their information. The clothes were identical garments, but they would now dress someone who moved through the world with grace rather than hurry, presence rather than anxiety. As Alina drove slowly down the winding forest road that led away from Whisperwind Cabin, she felt no sense of loss, or ending. In her rearview mirror, she could see the cabin growing smaller among its grove of snow-laden pines. But she carried its peace like a seed planted in the fertile soil of her transformed heart. The mountain's silence had taken up residence in her bones. Winter's wisdom flowed in her blood, and the sanctuary she had discovered in solitude would travel with her wherever life's journey led. The drive toward the city felt like a meditation in motion, each mile marking not distance from peace, but deeper integration of all she had learned and become. Alina knew that challenges waited ahead, the demands of work and relationships, the constant invitation to return to old patterns of hurry and worry. But she also knew that she was no longer the same person who would meet those challenges. She was someone who carried sanctuary within herself, who could create peace in any environment because she had remembered that peace was her natural state. As the forest gave way to foothills, and the foothills to valleys, where towns began to appear, Alina felt excitement rather than anxiety about re-entering the world. She had gifts to offer now, not just her professional skills, but the deeper gift of presence, the ability to meet each moment and each person from a place of peace rather than reactivity. She was returning not as someone who had escaped, but as someone who had remembered, carrying the mountain's teachings like medicine for a world that had forgotten how to rest. The winter sanctuary had given her its greatest gift, the understanding that she was already home, already whole, already everything she had been seeking. Now she could live from that remembering, creating sanctuary wherever she went, and offering others the same possibility of return to their own essential peace that the mountain had offered her. Chapter 11, Epilogue, The Endless Winter. 6 months after her return from Whisperwind Cabin, Alina sat in her apartment on a warm summer evening, watching thunderclouds gather over the city skyline. The rain that began to fall painted diagonal patterns across her windows, and she found herself smiling at the memory of winter's snow, performing its own unique dance on glass that had framed an entirely different world. Her life had changed in ways both subtle and profound since her retreat. From the outside, much appeared the same. She had returned to the same job, lived in the same apartment, moved through many of the same routines that had once felt like a treadmill leading nowhere. But everything was different because she was different, transformed not in dramatic ways, but in the quiet revolution that comes from learning to live from peace rather than in pursuit of it. Work had become an opportunity to practice presence rather than a source of stress to be endured. Meetings that once left her drained now became chances to offer the gift of true listening. Deadlines remained deadlines, but they no longer carried the emotional charge that had once made every project feel like a crisis. She moved through her professional responsibilities with the same deliberate grace she had learned while snowshoeing through mountain forests, bringing to each task the quality of attention that transformed obligation into offering. Her relationships had deepened as well, not because she tried to change them, but because she approached them from a place of fullness rather than need. Friends commented on the change they sensed in her, a quality of calm availability that made conversations feel more meaningful, a way of listening that created space for others to discover their own wisdom. She found herself naturally gravitating toward people who valued depth over surface stimulation, conversations that nourished rather than merely entertained. The apartment itself had become a different kind of sanctuary, though she had changed very little about its physical arrangement. The same furniture inhabited the same rooms. But Alina moved through the space with new reverence, understanding that any environment could be transformed by the quality of presence brought to it. She had created small altars of beauty, a corner by the window where she practiced morning meditation, a reading chair positioned to catch the evening light, a kitchen where cooking had become ceremony rather than chore. Most remarkably, she had discovered that the winter's peace lived within her regardless of external circumstances. Traffic jams became opportunities to practice the patience the mountain had taught her. Difficult conversations became chances to respond from stillness rather than react from agitation. Even the most chaotic days could not touch the sanctuary she had discovered at the center of her being, though they sometimes tested her memory of how to access it. Alina had returned to Whisperwind Cabin twice since that transformative first retreat, not because she needed to, but because she wanted to offer gratitude to the place that had midwifed her rebirth. Each visit revealed new layers of the mountain's teaching, deeper dimensions of the peace that had always been available, but required such specific conditions to be recognized. She had become one of those people Margaret had described, someone who carried the mountain's gifts into the world and inspired others to seek their own renewal. This evening, as rain painted patterns on her windows and thunder spoke in the distance, Alina felt the familiar stirring that preceded her evening writing practice. Her grandmother's journal had been filled and replaced twice now, each volume chronicling the continuing unfoldment of insights